I'm Hassan Giordano, and this is your Annapolis Report. Welcome to the Annapolis Report. I'm your host, Mr. Politics, and on today's premiere episode, we will discuss the legislative process. Over the next 90 days, I will take you on a journey throughout the legislative process here in the great state of Maryland. As you may know, or maybe not, Maryland's 188 state legislators, 141 members of the Maryland House of Delegates, and 47 members of the Maryland State Senate convene once a year for a 90-day legislative session. This year, the 439th session of the Maryland General Assembly convenes at 12 noon this Wednesday, January 9th, and stretches through midnight on the evening of April 8th, as they wrap up the 90-day process on a day on what is called sine die, which is Latin for without a day, or otherwise known or suggested to mean adjournment without a definitive day or time to reconvene. However, you and I will reconvene here each and every Monday over the next 3 months as I break down the legislative process for you, giving you the behind-the-scenes insight into the bills being introduced, the politics that are being played in those smoke-filled back rooms, and the news and information coming from Annapolis during this jam-packed 90-day session. So if you want to know the bills being introduced that could affect your everyday way of life and or your business or workplace, or you want to know what days and times certain standing committees are scheduled to hear particular bills, then look no further than the DMV Daily Annapolis Report. As your guide throughout this process, I want to make sure that you are informed on the overall schematics on the districts that represent the great state of Maryland, the legislators that represent those districts, the legislative lingo used in Annapolis that you may hear me reference from time to time, and the legislative process on how a bill becomes a law or gets put in a drawer to never be heard from again. So let's begin with the basics. Currently, there are 47 legislative districts that span across the free state of Maryland. Each has one state senator, while some have 3 state delegates and others have sub-districts represented by 1 or 2 members. So for all you math whizzes out there, that's right. That means that there are 47 state senators that make up the membership of the Maryland State Senate chambers, which is led by one man who has held this position since 1987, making him the longest tenured Senate president in the nation's history, let alone here in the great state of Maryland. Of course, I'm speaking of the senator from the 27th Legislative District, none other than Senate President Thomas Mike Miller. On the opposite side of Bladen Street, you have the Maryland House of Delegates. That body is made up of 141 state legislators known as state delegates from across the state of Maryland. That body is led by the Speaker of the House, and his name is Delegate Michael Bush, a state delegate for the past 32 years, representing the 30th Legislative District in Subdistrict 30A. He assumed the speakership in 2003, succeeding former Speaker Casper Taylor, and has been the longest-serving speaker in the history of the state, having served for 15 straight years as speaker, presiding over 21 legislative sessions, which includes the 6 special sessions that Maryland has had over that 15-year span. Each chamber has their own standing committees, the Senate having 6, including Budget and Taxation, Education, Health and Environmental Affairs, Finance, Judicial Proceedings, Rules, and Executive Nominations, though many members will consider the first 4 as the true standing committees, with Rules and Executive Nominations committees being looked at as the so-called ugly ducklings of those committees, unless, of course, they need one of their bills passed through the Rules Committee or have an interest in someone being nominated to a commission, a department, or an agency. The House has 7 standing committees, which includes Appropriations, Economic Matters, Environment and Transportation, Health and Government Operations, Judiciary, Ways and Means, and Rules and Executive Nominations are put together in one committee. Each committee has a chair and a vice chair, as well as subcommittees that make up that committee, who also have chairs. Some of them have vice chairs as well. There are also special select committees, statutory joint committees, work groups, etc., but for the moment, we will focus on the standing committees. Now, the legislative process is the mechanism in which the laws of Maryland are enacted during a 90-day legislative session that occurs annually and is required to convene on the second Wednesday of January each and every year by Article 3, Section 14 of the Maryland State Constitution. At 12 noon on Wednesday, January 9th, all 188 members of the Maryland General Assembly will be officially sworn in, some returning members and others newly elected members. This is why your recently elected state legislators have been known as senator or delegate-elect, as they are not officially senators or delegates until the first day of session once they are sworn in. This ceremonial day will be filled with legislators from across the state, along with lobbyists, interest groups, and citizens who converge on the state's capital to welcome these state legislators and their staff. 1 week later, Article 2, Section 1 of the Maryland Constitution states that the term of the governor shall commence. And on this day, Wednesday, January 16th, Governor Larry Hogan and Lieutenant Governor Boyd Rutherford will have their official inauguration on the steps of the Capitol, being sworn in for a second term. Mr. Hogan is the first Republican to win re-election as governor since 1954, when Theodore McKeldin won a second term. Now remember, Maryland did not have a lieutenant governor at that time, as the position of LG wasn't created until 1864, and then it was abolished 3 years later, only to be reestablished in 1970 by the name of Blair Lee. So essentially, Boyd Rutherford becomes the first Republican lieutenant governor to ever win re-election here in the great state of Maryland. Once session begins, bills are introduced on the floor of the chamber that the bill is put forth by the reading clerk announcing the bill number and the title of the bill and indicating what committee that bill is going to be referred. For instance, if Senator Giordano introduces a bill known as SB 1 or Senate Bill 1, entitled the Make Maryland Great Again Act, which seeks to hypothetically lower the age of individuals running for delegate and senator to 18 years of age, currently set at 21 and 25 years of age, respectively, in the House and the Senate. This bill will be assigned to the Senate's Education, Health, and Environmental Affairs Committee, otherwise known as EHEA, as most committees are referenced with their initials, like B&T for Budget and Taxation, JP for Judicial Proceedings, etc., etc. Now, bills can be introduced during the session or what is known as pre-filed before the start of the legislative session. Once a legislator has an issue that they want addressed in the form of legislation, they first start by giving that bill idea over to bill drafting at the Department of Legislative Services. They're going to then turn that concept into a legislative bill draft, referenced as a blue-black in the House due to the color of the paper. Once the legislator approves of the bill, they can then put that bill into the hopper, legislative lingo for essentially filing the bill with the chief clerk of the House or the secretary of the Senate for first reader. In first reader, that bill is then announced on the House or the Senate floor, along with its bill number and referred to its respective committee, where it is later assigned a hearing date where the general public, lobbyists, interest groups, and others are able to come and testify in favor or against that bill with public testimony. Each bill has a fiscal note attached to it, prepared by the Department of Legislative Services, as well as a brief synopsis on what that bill would do for each legislator to be able to understand the cost of the bill if enacted and what it looks to do. For instance, SB 1 will be read by the clerk during first reading, introduced as SB 1, the Make Maryland Great Again Act, referred to EHEA. After that, the committee then receives that bill. They set a bill hearing in place, a date and time in which that bill will be heard by the members of that committee, consisting of testimony that comes from the public for or against that bill. It is then typically assigned to a subcommittee where the members of that body vote the bill up or down or make changes to the bill, usually due to the concerns raised during public testimony. Now, public testimony consists of people testifying before that committee on behalf or against that bill, but they can also submit written testimony as well, either in conjunction with their oral testimony or in place of. If the bill then comes out of subcommittee, it is brought to the full committee for a vote. If a majority vote of that committee, for the members who are in attendance decide to vote favorably, the bill is then sent back to the chamber's floor, either the House or the Senate chambers, where the bill will be presented to the entire body for passage. Now, typically, presented to the body is by the chairman of the committee that the bill was assigned. The bill is then reported on in its current form, recommended either favorably, unfavorably, favorably with amendments, or rarely with no recommendation at all. If the bill was amended by the committee it was assigned, the chamber first votes on the amendments itself, and then the bill is voted on as amended. Amendments can also be made from the floor, during which time is known as second reader by any member of that chamber. Those amendments are voted up or down, and once all amendments have been heard, the presiding officer then orders the bill printed for third reader, unless in some cases it's held over. And when it's held over, typically it's held over for a day or a few days for individuals to look into it for further action. When it comes back, third reader is where the bill is presented to the body in its final form, with all the amendments passed favorably written into the final version of the bill. The bill is then offered up to the body to vote favorably or unfavorably, up or down, on the bill as amended, but no amendments are allowed during third reader for final passage. Once the bill is passed through one chamber, it is then sent over to the opposite chamber for their consideration. There's a date in March that's usually what's called a crossover date. This is the final date in which all bills that were heard in the House or heard in the Senate flip over to the opposite chamber. So anything that was heard in the House and passed has to be sent over to the Senate, or anything heard in the Senate has to be sent over to the House by this crossover date. The bill is then first read on the chamber floor, then it's sent to its respective committee. It's given a hearing, voted on by that committee, sent back to that chamber's floor for any possible amendments, and then passed or killed. Now, if the bill is amended in the opposite chamber, the bill is then returned to its original chamber, where a vote is taken on a motion to concur or reject the amendments. If the body concurs, the final vote is taken on the bill as amended, and action is complete. The bill is reprinted, enrolled to include any added amendments, and presented to the governor for his signature. However, if the amendments are rejected, two courses of action can take place. Either the amending chamber can request to withdraw its amendments, or the chamber can request what is known as a conference committee to resolve the differences between the two chambers. So say, for instance, Senator Giordano's bill to lower the age made it through the Senate with no amendments. But the House decided not to lower the age to 18 to run for both Senate and delegate, but instead lower the age to 18 to run for delegate, but only lowered it to 21 to run for Senate. Now, both sides will then meet in what's called a conference committee to see if they can work out a compromise. This process has 3 members from each chamber appointed to the bill's conference committee, assigned by the presiding officers of each chamber. A report on that conference committee is then sent back to both chambers to either be adopted or rejected. If adopted, the bill is voted on for final passage in both chambers. But if it's rejected, the conference committee can be instructed to either reconvene, new members can be appointed to the conference committee, or they can just kill the bill altogether. So say in this case, the Senate decides to accept the House's amendments in order just to get something passed. So then the conference committee report would be to accept the House version, which is adopted, passed by both chambers, and then it would be sent to the governor for his signature. The governor can either sign the bill into law, veto the bill within 30 days after being presented with the bill, or allow it to become law by taking no action at all in those 30 days. The only 2 bills not presented to the governor due to his action not being necessary is that of the budget bill, which must be presented by the governor to the legislature by the 10th day after the start of the legislative session, and passed by both chambers 1 week prior to adjournment of the 90-day session, and a constitutional amendment, which the governor cannot veto. The governor can veto any other piece of legislation, excluding the budget, of course. However, both chambers have the ability to override the governor's veto with a 3/5 majority vote by both chambers, known as a supermajority, except during the first year of a new term, which would be this legislative session. I hope you got all that. It's important in knowing that, because when it comes down to the wire, and we're talking about this week after week, and you're wondering how a particular bill got killed or how it passed one chamber but never became law, you'll have a better understanding on why by going through this particular podcast. There are other ways of killing bills, of course, such as a committee chairman sticking it in the drawer, never to be heard from again. Trust me, I've had this done to one of my bills, in fact, and I'm still haven't heard from that bill 10 years later. So as you can imagine, they do some funky things down there in the legislature. That's why this podcast is so particularly important, especially if you have powerful enemies against that bill or they particularly just don't like you. That's why we are going to look into everything that happens down there in Annapolis and give you an in-depth analysis on almost every bill that's being presented. Now, mind you, there's typically usually over 2,000 bills that are introduced during the legislative session. So we obviously won't get to every single bill that is introduced, but we're going to try to give you as much information as possible on a weekly basis. That's why we're supposed to have a checks and balances system of government. The problem is when one party rules both chambers of the legislative process, it typically doesn't matter who you have in the executive branch of government. Case in point, Governor Hogan can't step in and have his Republican allies save a piece of his legislation in either chamber because, frankly, they have no control or power. For instance, not one Republican is a chair or vice chair of a standing committee because the party in power never allows for that to happen. So in this case, Democrats control every facet of Maryland state legislature, both the House and the Senate. And the GOP doesn't have enough members in either chamber to stop a bill from being passed, as Democrats only need 71 votes in the House and 24 votes in the Senate for a simple majority, or 85 votes in the House and 29 in the Senate for a supermajority. And 47 seats in the House, since Republicans only have 15 seats in the Senate and 47 seats in the House, they have no control over the passage of legislation or the ability to block veto overrides or constitutional amendments. The only plus they have is with a fellow Republican governor in place is to have someone from their party controlling the purse strings, to some degree at least, and in charge of appointing members to the state agencies and departments, as well as to boards and commissions, but most of them are still required to be approved by the state Senate. So as you can see, not an easy role if you're a Republican. These appointees that I just mentioned, they're known as greenbag appointments. They're submitted by the governor to the legislature on the 40th day of the 90-day session. The governor also sits on what's the spending board that's known as the Board of Public Works. This consists of the governor, the comptroller, and the state treasurer, who is a person that is elected by the members of the Maryland General Assembly via a joint ballot of both chambers during the first term following an election. So that means that the members of the Maryland General Assembly will elect a treasurer during this upcoming session, which has been a woman by the name of Nancy Kopp, who they've elected since 2002. Now, while the governor submits his proposed budget to the members of the legislature by the 10th day of the start of the legislative session, it is the members of the state legislature that have the ability to rearrange some of those numbers. We will get into that process in more depth at a later date, as this is a very critical part of the legislative session, especially since the state constitution only requires that legislators do two things each year: adequately fund K through 12 education and pass a balanced budget. Everything else is a plus and technically not required by the state's governing document. This is why the state constitution requires that the budget be passed 7 days prior to the adjournment of the legislative 90-day session, otherwise ordering the governor to issue a proclamation extending the session for a period the governor deems fit to pass the budget, at which time no other legislation shall be considered. Now, the legislature can also call a special session and continue a session not longer than 90 days each year for a specific issue in what is known as a special session. One such issue that may force the Maryland General Assembly and or the governor to call for a special session later this year is if the Supreme Court, who is set to hear a case involving gerrymandered redistricting congressional district lines, rules in favor of the plaintiffs in the lower court's ruling that it was done unconstitutionally, which would then force the legislature and the governor to come up with a process on how to redraw the congressional district lines. Now, to wrap up this legislative process podcast, I'll leave you with a few tidbits. The legislative session extends for 90 days straight, not taking off for any holidays or inclement weather unless otherwise specified. But they only have 90 days to get it all in. Rain, snow, sleet, or shine. You can visit the State House, but will be required to present ID when entering the government buildings. You have several different delegations, caucuses, and groups, such as the Black Caucus, the Women's Caucus, the Democratic Caucus, as well as a delegation for each of the state's 23 counties, and of course the one city, Baltimore City, i.e. the Baltimore City House delegation or the Senate delegation. Same thing goes for Baltimore County, Prince George's County, and all of the 23 counties that represent the great state of Maryland, each of whom will meet at different days, times, and in different places throughout both chambers. So for more information on when they meet in these groups, or if you want to look up committee makeups, bill numbers, hearings, dates, who your district legislator is, and much, much more, make sure you visit their website, www.mgaleg.maryland, spelled out, .gov. Again, www.mgaleg.maryland.gov. You can also always go to dmvdaily.news to be able to find the link to that website, as well as to find out more about the legislative process and the Maryland General Assembly and the current legislative session. Now, I'll see you back here each and every week during this 90-day span as I break down week by week what has happened during the 439th legislative session of the Maryland General Assembly in our DMV Daily Annapolis Report. This is Hassan Giordano signing off, and I'll see you next week.